March 12, 1899. Nikola Tesla sat alone in his dimly lit laboratory, the hum of his machines providing the only sound in the vast cavernous space. Flickers of electricity crackled intermittently in the dark corners of the room, like ghosts trying to escape. Tesla had been working tirelessly for days, experimenting with his latest invention, one that promised to revolutionize wireless communication. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough, something that would forever change humanity's understanding of energy. But lately, something else had begun to happen, something unsettling. The visions had returned. Tesla wiped his brow, staring blankly at the pulsing coils. His once clear thoughts were now clouded by haunting images that surfaced at the edges of his consciousness. Shadows, barely seen, but felt. Ever since he was a child, he had been plagued by these phantoms of the mind, manifestations he could not explain. He dismissed them as part of his overactive imagination, a byproduct of his brilliant but tormented mind. Yet now, in the stillness of his laboratory, they had taken on a different, more sinister quality. It was as if something or someone was watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. Tesla's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the frequency on his newest invention. He had tried to ignore the eerie feelings, chalking it up to exhaustion and the constant pressure to succeed. But then the tapping started. At first it had been faint, almost imperceptible. He would hear it late at night, just as he drifted off into restless sleep. A persistent tapping, like fingernails scratching at the walls of his mind. He assumed it was the wind, or perhaps a malfunction in his equipment. But now, sitting alone in the room, the tapping grew louder, closer. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was deliberate. Suddenly, the room grew colder, a chill creeping in that made Tesla pull his coat tighter around himself. He looked around, eyes darting to the shadows, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Still, the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. His heartbeat quickened, his breath shallow. And then, from the far end of the lab, he saw it, a faint, shimmering outline, just standing there. The shape was human-like, but distorted, as though it was caught between two realities. Tesla blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light. But it wasn't. The figure remained. It was watching him. Tesla stood abruptly, knocking over a pile of blueprints. The figure didn't move but seemed to ripple slightly, as if it were made of static. His rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that it was a figment of his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. He had spent years pushing the boundaries of science, of electricity, of the very forces that govern the universe. What if he had gone too far? What if he had opened a door that should have remained closed? "Who are you?" Tesla whispered, his voice trembling, though he barely recognized it. "What do you want?" The figure remained silent, but the tapping resumed. Louder now, insistent. Tesla covered his ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside his head, echoing through his skull like a relentless drumbeat. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, gasping for air. And then, in the midst of the tapping, came a voice. Faint at first, but unmistakable. "Nikola." Tesla's eyes widened in terror. He knew that voice. It was the voice of his brother, Dane, who had died when Tesla was a child. Dane's death had been a tragic accident, one that Tesla had never fully come to terms with. The guilt, the grief. It had followed him for years, shaping the man he had become. But Dane was dead. He couldn't be here, now, in this room. "Nikola!" The voice called again, this time closer, as if it were whispering directly into his ear. "No!" Tesla shouted, scrambling to his feet. "You're not real! You're not real!" But the figure stepped forward, its outline becoming sharper, more defined. Tesla could see his brother's face now, pale and twisted in anguish. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull Tesla in, threatening to drown him in their darkness. "You left me," the voice said, a mix of sorrow and anger. "You forgot me." Tesla shook his head violently, backing away from the apparition. His heart pounded in his chest and his mouth went dry. I couldn't save you. It wasn't my fault," he cried, his voice cracking under the weight of years of buried guilt. The figure advanced, slow and deliberate. Tesla's machines whirred around him, lights flickering, the air buzzing with an unnatural energy. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Tesla could see his breath now, misting in the air. "I've been waiting," Dane's voice whispered, closer still. "Waiting for you to join me." Tesla backed into a wall, trapped, his mind racing for an escape. The tapping was deafening now, a maddening rhythm that threatened to drive him insane. He pressed his hands to his head, trying to shut it out, but it was no use. The figure was inches away now, its cold, bony hand reaching out toward him. Tesla's vision blurred, and his body trembled with fear. Was this his punishment? Had he, in his pursuit of knowledge, somehow crossed the line between life and death? He had always believed in the unseen forces of the universe, the energy that flowed through all things. But this was something else, something evil. As the ghostly hand touched his shoulder, Tesla felt an overwhelming wave of cold wash over him, freezing him to the core. His body seized and his mind went blank. For a moment, everything went silent. And then, in the stillness, he heard it, a single soft laugh. A laugh he hadn't heard since childhood. The lab plunged into darkness, leaving Tesla standing alone with the dead. Tesla awoke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was eerily quiet now, the hum of his machines strangely absent. For a moment he wondered if it had all been a dream, a nightmare conjured from the depths of his overworked mind. But as he glanced around the lab, the scattered blueprints and overturned equipment told him otherwise. Something had been here, something real. He stood shakily, his legs barely able to support him. The cold touch on his shoulder still lingered, as if the spirit of his brother had left an imprint on his very skin. His heart raced as he replayed the terrifying encounter in his mind. Dane was dead. He had been dead for years. Yet somehow, Tesla felt as though the veil between worlds had been lifted, and his brother's tortured soul had crossed over to reach him. But why now? Tesla walked to his desk, where his most recent notes and calculations were strewn about. The equations, once so clear and precise, now swam before his eyes. He sat down, rubbing his temples, trying to make sense of the chaos inside his head. His experiments, his theories, they were meant to unlock the mysteries of energy, to harness the unseen forces that connected all living things. But perhaps in doing so, he had stirred something darker, something that was never meant to be disturbed. The tapping returned. Tesla froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The same relentless rhythm, like the ticking of a clock counting down to some inevitable horror. He rose from his chair, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of Dane. Yet the presence lingered, suffocating him with its weight. "I won't let you in," Tesla whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't belong here." The tapping grew louder. Desperate, Tesla rushed to his equipment, adjusting dials, turning switches, trying to channel the energy in the room. He believed that if he could manipulate the frequencies, he might be able to dispel the entity, to push it back to whatever realm it had come from. His hands moved frantically across the controls, sparks flying as the machines roared to life. But something was wrong. Instead of driving the spirit away, the energy in the room seemed to intensify. The lights flickered wildly, the coils buzzing with a malevolent force. Tesla stumbled backward as a violent gust of wind tore through the lab, knocking over shelves and scattering papers like dead leaves in a storm. The machines pulsed with an unnatural light, glowing brighter and brighter until Tesla had to shield his eyes. And then, from the heart of the chaos, he heard it again. "Nikola!" The voice was louder now, clearer, as though his brother were standing right beside him. Tesla's blood ran cold as the figure appeared once more, emerging from the blinding light. Dane stood there, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes empty black voids. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, other shadowy forms began to materialize. Vague, distorted shapes of people long dead, their faces contorted in pain and despair. They filled the room, crowding around Tesla, their cold, lifeless gazes fixed on him. Tesla backed away in terror, his mind reeling. These weren't just spirits. These were the forgotten souls. The ones who had been lost in the pursuit of progress, of knowledge, of power. The men who had died building the machines, the workers crushed under the weight of innovation. And Dane had been the first casualty of Tesla's insatiable need to understand the universe. The figures moved closer, their ghostly hands reaching out, brushing against Tesla's skin like icy tendrils. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of his guilt pressed down on him. He had always believed that his work was for the betterment of mankind, that the sacrifices made along the way were necessary for progress. But now, standing face to face with the dead, he saw the truth. They had never left him. The visions, the nightmares, the strange occurrences, all of it had been leading to this moment. He had opened a door to something beyond the physical world, something that could not be undone. The very forces he had sought to control had turned against him, and now they wanted revenge. Why are you here?" Tesla whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "What do you want from me?" Dane stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his hollow eyes locked on Tesla's. For a moment there was silence. The other spirits faded into the background, their presence still oppressive but distant. "You left me behind," Dane said, his voice cold and accusing. "You forgot me, Nikola. You forgot all of us." Tesla shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. I didn't mean to. I never wanted this." His voice cracked as the weight of years of suppressed guilt overwhelmed him. But the spirits did not care for his apologies. The tapping resumed, louder now, like a drumbeat echoing through the hollow space of the lab. It reverberated in Tesla's skull, driving him to the edge of madness. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but the sound was relentless, consuming him. "You can't escape us," Dane whispered, his voice a haunting melody that filled the air. "We are a part of you. You brought us here. You will never be free." The words cut through Tesla like a knife. He sank to the floor, defeated, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The room spun around him, the tapping now a cacophony of noise that he could not escape. The spirits closed in, their cold hands reaching for him, pulling him down into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. The air in the room grew still. The figures vanished, leaving Tesla alone in the silence of his ruined lab. He lay there for a long time, his mind numb, his body shaking. The machines were dark, the lights dim. Everything was still. But Tesla knew the truth. They hadn't left. They were always with him. They always would be. And in the quiet, he could still hear the faint, rhythmic tapping, waiting.